By early 1945, the United States had achieved something that few American commanders had imagined possible just 3 years earlier: the ability to strike directly at the Japanese home islands with overwhelming air power. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber ever built up to that point, could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it, carrying massive payloads from bases thousands of miles away. With the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas, the 20th Air Force suddenly possessed a series of runways from which the long-range Superfortress could launch near-daily raids on Japan's industrial centers. What made these raids different from earlier strategic bombing campaigns was not only the scale, but the increasingly psychological dimension that the American High Command decided to introduce. For all the destructive potential of incendiaries and high explosives, planners within the Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch believed that the Japanese spirit could be broken not only by crushing cities, but by crushing morale, and especially by attacking concepts of shame, face, and social honor that lay at the core of Japanese military culture. American intelligence analysts, Japanese-American linguists, and military psychologists studied captured diaries, intercepted communications, and countless accounts from Japanese POWs. What they learned was stark. The Imperial Japanese military maintained cohesion through a rigid moral code built on sacrifice, purity, and absolute loyalty to family and emperor. The fear of public humiliation ran deeper than the fear of death. A soldier might endure starvation, disease, or impossible odds, but the idea that his suffering might be meaningless, or worse, mocked, could unravel psychological defenses that no artillery barrage could touch. This understanding led to one of the strangest, most controversial intelligence operations of the entire war. Instead of blowing enemy positions apart, some American aircraft would drop leaflets, letters, threats, rumors, and in the most notorious cases, actual women's underwear. Their goal was simple: weaponize humiliation. The decision to shift part of the bombing fleet into psychological warfare began months before the atomic bombs and well before Japan's final collapse. American strategists wanted to undermine morale among Japanese troops, not only in the home islands, but also on hundreds of isolated garrisons scattered throughout the Pacific. These men often had no realistic hope of rescue, resupply, or relief. Many lived on islands bypassed by American forces. Cut off from communication, except for sporadic radio messages, isolation bred desperation, and desperation made them vulnerable to psychological attacks. It was in this environment that Operation Sleepy Time, an unofficial name later applied to the campaign, took shape. It wasn't simply propaganda. It was humiliation as a military tool. To carry out such an operation, the Americans needed a delivery system capable of reaching far-flung Japanese positions while remaining safe from anti-aircraft fire. The B-29 was ideal. It could fly at altitudes where interception was unlikely, glide over enemy territory undetected during night raids, and carry leaflet bombs in place of explosives. These leaflet bombs were essentially cardboard cylinders packed with thousands of messages, photographs, or items. When released, they burst open at preset altitudes, scattering their contents across miles of terrain. A single bomber could drop millions of sheets in one mission. At night, the sight resembled a blizzard illuminated by the moon, drifting silently across garrisons, villages, and even major cities. In many cases, the Japanese didn't even hear the bomber, only waking to find the ground covered in papers or objects that mocked their loyalty, their leaders, and their families. The earliest leaflet missions were relatively tame: warnings to civilians, threats of invasion, and general messages about Japan's impending defeat. But these had limited impact. Soldiers on isolated islands had already heard similar rumors, and their commanders often warned them against believing anything dropped from the sky. So the OWI and Psychological Warfare Branch decided to escalate. They crafted messages aimed directly at the one fear Japanese soldiers could not admit: the fear that the women they left behind were being unfaithful. For an imperial soldier, the idea that his wife or girlfriend might be sleeping with another man, and especially an American, attacked not only personal honor, but his identity as a protector of the family. To fail his family was to fail Japan itself. What followed was unlike anything seen in modern psychological warfare. The United States produced a series of leaflets featuring photographs, some staged, some modified, some taken from seized materials, showing Japanese women in lingerie posing suggestively, sometimes nude, sometimes embracing American servicemen. The captions were viciously crafted by bilingual specialists who understood how to inflict the maximum psychological wound with the fewest words. Many messages told soldiers that their wives had grown tired of waiting, that they were now laughing, eating well, and enjoying the company of American soldiers, while their husbands starved on forgotten islands. Other leaflets claimed Japanese women preferred American men because they were stronger, healthier, and could provide food. Some letters were written in the style of confessions from a woman to a husband she no longer loved, seemingly personal, intimate, and devastating. These leaflets did not simply imply betrayal. They declared it openly, graphically, and repeatedly. Entire villages were listed by name, along with fabricated notes about which household supposedly welcomed Americans. Soldiers unfamiliar with propaganda, or already suffering malnutrition and hopelessness, often found these leaflets more believable than their commanders' reassurances. Even more shocking were the Black Widow series of missions, the flights that dropped bundles of actual silk panties. Each pair had notes sewn inside, suggesting they were a gift from your wife and the U.S. Army Air Forces. The symbolism was unmistakable. You are gone, forgotten, and replaced. To American air crews, the missions were bizarre, but not especially risky. They flew at night, often at maximum altitude, encountering minimal defenses. Some crews joked about their cargo. Others felt uneasy participating in what they considered psychological cruelty. But the orders stood, and the missions continued. Hundreds of thousands of leaflets rained over the Pacific and Japan, drifting into barracks, foxholes, caves, and villages. Although not every leaflet reached its target, enough did to produce noticeable effects. Reports from interrogated POWs revealed that many Japanese soldiers felt devastated, enraged, or deeply ashamed. Several admitted that their morale collapsed entirely after reading or seeing the materials. Some commanders tried to ban their troops from picking up any paper at all. But curiosity proved stronger than discipline. Within weeks, the psychological seeds began to take root. The B-29 crews who carried out these psychological warfare missions in 1945 did not begin with a clear understanding of what they were stepping into. When the U.S. began the strategic bombing campaign against Japan from the Marianas, the island bases at Tinian, Saipan, and Guam were still being built, flooded with crews who had trained for high-altitude precision raids, not propaganda flights. Many of the young airmen had come straight from technical schools and stateside training fields that emphasized Norden bomb sites, formation flying, and the cold efficiency of industrial warfare. Yet within weeks of arriving, some found themselves reassigned to a strange new duty: one that took place at night, alone, with bomb bays carrying no explosives at all. The Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch had devised a campaign unlike anything the U.S. military had attempted before, and the airmen chosen for these missions quickly realized they were participants in an operation designed not to destroy factories or burn cities, but to target something far more fragile: the morale of the Japanese fighting man. To make these flights possible, teams of translators, psychologists, artists, and intelligence officers gathered in makeshift offices on Saipan and Guam. They examined captured diaries, intercepted mail, interrogations, and even secret police reports to understand the mental state of the Japanese soldier in the final year of the war. What they found was a paradox. On one hand, the Imperial Japanese Army had drilled into its troops a code of self-sacrifice, obedience, and absolute loyalty to emperor and nation. On the other hand, morale was collapsing quietly, especially among isolated garrisons and soldiers who had not heard from home in years. The home front was starving, cities were burned out, and families were scattered by evacuations. Letters arrived irregularly, if at all. Many soldiers feared not only defeat, but dishonor. Dishonor as a warrior, dishonor as a protector, and dishonor as a husband or son. The psychological warfare teams realized immediately that the deepest fear among Japanese troops was not death in battle, but the shame of discovering that all they had sacrificed had been for nothing, or worse, that their families no longer honored them. This insight led to the creation of propaganda that pushed far past traditional wartime leaflets. Rather than urging surrender directly or making rational appeals, these new leaflets worked on emotional vulnerability. They were designed to break the backbone of a warrior culture. The most infamous series, the so-called Black Widow or Panties leaflets, featured images that were never meant for public view back home in the United States. They were explicit not by modern standards, but by 1940 standards. They were shocking. Photos showed Japanese women smiling in lingerie or partially nude, sometimes posed with American men or seated in suggestive situations. The accompanying messages, written in carefully nuanced Japanese, suggested abandonment, infidelity, humiliation. They insinuated that American soldiers were taking care of the women the Japanese soldiers had left behind, feeding them, comforting them, visiting them. The tone was not crude, it was calculated. Every sentence was designed to strike at the heart of honor, duty, and masculine pride. To a soldier steeped in the imperial code, such humiliation could be unbearable. Some variations of the leaflets were even more personal. Using captured address books, censored mail records, and local registries, the teams created leaflets that listed real home addresses, sometimes with messages implying that the families living there were now friendly with occupying Americans, or were enjoying a safer life without the soldier. Others carried fake love letters, supposedly written by a soldier's girlfriend or wife, apologizing for drifting into a relationship with an American because the soldier had been gone too long. These letters described warm meals, protection, and security, everything the starving, exhausted, malaria-ridden troops lacked. The pieces were assembled with a cruel precision, not simply to shock, but to sow corrosive doubt that spread silently through units already operating at the limits of endurance. The inclusion of actual silk panties, real physical objects dropped from American aircraft into Japanese-held territory, was perhaps the most audacious element of the entire campaign. This wasn't meant to be comedic. It was psychological warfare at its sharpest edge. The panties had messages sewn inside them, taunting messages intended to evoke feelings of betrayal, suspicion, and unmanly disgrace. For soldiers conditioned since childhood to associate purity, loyalty, and national identity with the women in their lives, the idea that these same women might be intimate with American men was emotionally devastating. Reports from captured diaries and interrogations later revealed that many soldiers believed the panties must have been taken from Japanese women themselves, though in reality, they were purchased in bulk on the U.S. mainland. The illusion was enough. In several instances, Japanese officers ordered their men to burn the leaflets immediately and punish anyone caught even holding one. Yet soldiers kept them anyway. Some read them secretly at night. Others hid them inside clothing or boots. And some, as chilling battlefield reports revealed, were found dead with the panties clutched in their hands. To deliver these psychological weapons, the B-29 crews flew missions that looked deceptively simple on paper, but were often incredibly risky. The crews removed the bomb sites, removed the remote-controlled turrets, sometimes even removed armor plating to make room for leaflet bombs, giant cardboard cylinders that burst open at a preset altitude and scattered millions of sheets into the jet stream. These flights usually occurred at night, a single aircraft flying alone, relying on radar navigation and hoping to avoid night fighters. The B-29's massive engines, glowing exhaust, and heat signature made them tempting targets. But the Japanese air defense network was fraying by mid-1945. Communication lines were unreliable, radar stations understaffed, and many night fighter pilots were inexperienced. Still, the danger remained. Some B-29s returned with flak holes. Others reported ghostly shadows of fighters tailing them just out of visual range. But because these missions carried no bombs and posed little immediate threat to infrastructure, they were rarely given priority by Japanese air defenses. Yet the impact they had was real. Reports filtered in from codebreakers, spies in China, intercepted communications, and testimonies of prisoners. Some Japanese units experienced spikes in desertion after leaflet drops. Others reported increased suicides or sudden declines in discipline. Soldiers argued among themselves, accusing one another of secretly keeping the leaflets. Officers threatened severe punishment simply for looking at them. The imperial military feared these propaganda pieces more than incendiaries because they struck at something firebombing could not reach: the mind. Over the spring and summer of 1945, as Japan struggled under bombardment, starvation, and the collapse of its supply network, morale, already fragile, began to crack. Every leaflet drop widened the fissures. These missions continued until the very final weeks before the war ended, weaving themselves into the broader tapestry of strategic pressure that brought Japan to surrender. They were not heroic in the traditional sense. No medals were awarded for dropping panties from a bomber, but the men who flew those missions played a peculiar, seldom remembered part in the final psychological unraveling of a nation under immense strain, using ideas instead of explosives to weaken an enemy already teetering at the edge. By the time the leaflet operations escalated in the early summer of 1945, the psychological war over Japan had entered a phase unmatched in any previous conflict. Entire populations were now targets, not with explosives, but with ideas carefully engineered to slip past the armor of discipline, indoctrination, and emperor-centered loyalty that had defined Japan's wartime psyche. And deep inside the Marianas, under canvas awnings lit by bare bulbs, a group of linguists, sociologists, Nisei translators, and military psychologists sat at long wooden tables, drafting the next wave of messages. The stakes had never been higher. American commanders needed Japan to crack, or at least bend, before an invasion that they feared would claim 1 million Allied casualties. And inside that tense environment emerged the most infamous and taboo psychological weapon the U.S. ever deployed: the Panties leaflets. The internal meetings were a strange fusion of academic debate, military urgency, and the uneasy humor that often characterizes war. Some of the translators were young Japanese Americans whose families were still locked in internment camps back in the United States. Others were Ivy League sociologists who had spent years studying Japanese cultural norms. All of them had been tasked with answering one question: what message would terrify a Japanese soldier more than bombs? The answer they eventually settled on was not fear of death, or starvation, or defeat. It was the fear of losing honor through the imagined betrayal of the women back home. The Imperial Japanese Army had built its identity on absolute masculine duty, the idea that a soldier's sacrifice preserved his household's purity, his wife's devotion, and his family's good name. If that illusion was shattered, morale could collapse. And so, with a kind of clinical precision, the team designed messages meant to pierce the most sensitive psychological weakness in the Japanese military structure. The first wave of leaflets had been relatively tame: warnings about raids, announcements of upcoming bombings, appeals to surrender, or statistics showing the hopelessness of Japan's situation. But they barely made a dent. Japanese commanders collected and burned them, and the soldiers responded with indifference born of indoctrination. It was only when the team introduced sexual humiliation, an approach considered so outrageous that some U.S. officials hesitated, that things changed. Photographs of Japanese women wearing lingerie or posing with American servicemen were paired with text written in flowing, feminine handwriting. These weren't simply crude insinuations. They were designed with deep cultural awareness. The letters described longing, abandonment, and new relationships formed out of necessity. Some implied infidelity gently, others did it graphically, in ways that no Japanese serviceman could ignore. The linguists crafted phrases that mimicked provincial dialects or rural grammar patterns, making the messages feel achingly authentic. The day the first Black Widow series went out, a B-29 crew gathered on a dim airstrip on Tinian. They had flown deadly missions before: incendiary raids over Tokyo, high-altitude strikes on industrial hubs, harrowing runs through anti-aircraft fire. But on this night, as the engines roared and the propellers kicked up swirls of dust, the bomb bay of their aircraft held nothing lethal. Instead, it carried giant cardboard casings packed with leaflets and bundles of silk panties. Some crew members laughed, unable to reconcile the absurdity of the cargo with the deadly seriousness of their larger mission. Others simply shrugged. War had taught them that almost anything, no matter how strange, could become a tool if it shortened the conflict. Once airborne, the B-29 climbed into a moonlit sky. The leaflet missions were flown at night, not only for safety, but for psychological impact. Nighttime in Japan, especially in cities stripped of electricity by bombing, was thick with silence and fear. A lone aircraft passing overhead could drop material that drifted slowly into courtyards, farmland, temple grounds, and barracks. When the bomber reached its release point, the crew pulled the lanyards and sent the leaflet bombs tumbling downward. At 5,000 feet, they burst open like seeds pods, scattering millions of sheets into the warm wind. Below, soldiers looked up in confusion as white specks floated down like snowflakes. Some grabbed the sheets immediately. Others recoiled, aware that being caught with Allied propaganda could lead to reprimand or worse. But curiosity, especially among the younger conscripts, often won. In the days that followed, the U.S. analyzed intercepted radio chatter, decoded field messages, and interrogated captured prisoners. The results shocked even the psychological warfare planners. Entire garrisons were thrown into disarray. Officers confiscated every slip of paper they could find, but the leaflets circulated faster than they could be burned. Some Japanese soldiers tore the messages apart in rage, but many couldn't stop reading them. The idea that their wives or fiancés had abandoned them, that their sacrifices were meaningless, pierced straight to the cultural heart of a soldier's identity. The Japanese military was founded on ideals of purity, endurance, and unquestioned loyalty. These leaflets suggested that while the soldiers starved in caves, their women were being seduced by well-fed Americans with full stomachs and no fear of losing the war. Reports began to emerge of soldiers arguing violently with each other, accusing one another of dishonorable thoughts. Some cried alone. Others folded the leaflets carefully and hid them. There were even documented cases of suicide, soldiers unable to cope with the idea that their imagined place of honor back home had been stolen from them. Desertion in isolated posts climbed. A few surrendered with the leaflets clutched in their hands. Japanese commanders labeled the material spiritual poison, an enemy weapon more dangerous than explosives because it attacked the soul instead of the body. As summer deepened, the missions grew bolder. More B-29s participated, launching night after night from the Marianas. The men flying these aircraft understood that psychological warfare carried none of the immediate drama of gunfire or explosions. Yet it was just as crucial. Every leaflet dropped reduced the fighting spirit of a man who might otherwise die in a hopeless banzai charge. Every rumor spread by the panty bombs eroded a chain of command already fraying under starvation, illness, and constant air raids. The air crews often discussed what they were doing. Some joked nervously that they were flying the dirtiest missions in the Pacific. Others felt the seriousness beneath the absurdity. The war was reaching its brutal climax, and if humiliation could break an empire faster than firebombing, then they were willing to use it. What none of them knew at the time was that the entire operation would remain buried beneath layers of military secrecy for decades, overshadowed by atomic bombs and massive battles. The men who flew the missions rarely spoke about them. The psychologists who designed the leaflets never publicly admitted how far they had pushed the boundaries of wartime propaganda. And for the Japanese soldiers who survived the drops, the shame attached to the leaflets ensured that few would ever describe their impact openly. Yet within those drifting sheets of paper lay a weapon unlike any used before or after. A weapon crafted not to kill bodies, but to unravel the spirit holding a nation together. By late spring of 1945, as the incendiary campaign against Japan intensified and B-29s turned entire districts of Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe into oceans of fire, another quieter war was unfolding above the same cities. One fought not with high explosive clusters, but with carefully engineered humiliation. The psychological warfare crews of the 313th and 73rd Bomb Wings had refined their tactics. Night after night, the leaflet B-29s flew, alone or in small groups, maintaining radio silence, drifting across Japan's cities at altitudes low enough to ensure maximum leaflet dispersion, yet high enough to evade searchlights. Their engines made a sound Japanese civilians had come to dread, a distant, persistent throb that meant something was falling, even if it wasn't fire. And as these missions accumulated, the dismantling of morale, something the Imperial General Staff once believed impossible, became measurable in increasingly alarming reports from the Home Ministry. Detention centers filled with citizens caught reading or hiding the leaflets. Police seized everything from photos of lingerie-clad Japanese women to fabricated love letters and bundles of foreign-made silk underwear stitched with taunting messages. Soldiers on leave encountered the leaflets and were shaken, unsure whether the propaganda had any basis in reality. Some returned to their units angry or disillusioned, while others never returned at all. Psychological warfare analysts in Washington and at the OWI's Morale Operations Branch had predicted this phenomenon. They knew that Japan's wartime culture had been engineered around concepts of sexual purity, feminine loyalty, and masculine duty to the emperor. If that triangle was broken, they believed, the entire psychological foundation of Japan's war effort could be weakened. And in intercepts from the Japanese High Command, these predictions began to show disturbing accuracy. Reports from garrisons on small islands such as Truk, Peleliu, and isolated outposts in the Philippines described Japanese soldiers discovering the so-called Panties leaflets. Some soldiers experienced uncontrollable rage, shouting that their wives must have been coerced by American occupiers. Others believed the propaganda literally, trembling at the thought that the honor of their family had been stained while they served the emperor. Suicide reports increased. Some soldiers killed themselves immediately after reading the leaflets, leaving notes describing unbearable shame. Others conducted impulsive attacks against American positions, driven not by tactical reasoning, but by the despair these leaflets intentionally provoked. Back on Tinian, the crews preparing the leaflet bombs understood that, despite the bizarre nature of their cargo, their missions were considered as strategically essential as incendiary raids. Many of them had previously flown combat missions over Japan and had lost friends to flak or fighters. Now their role required them to climb into the same type of aircraft, take the same risks, but carry what some referred to jokingly as the dirtiest bomb load of the war. In place of bomb site checks, ordnance teams packed long cardboard cylinders loaded with millions of leaflets. They ensured timed fuses were calibrated so the tubes would burst at approximately 5,000 feet over Japanese cities, scattering the propaganda in spiraling, glittering clouds, illuminated only by moonlight or the distant glow of burning industrial districts. Some B-29 crews felt humor in the work. Others felt discomfort. But all followed the mission orders with the same discipline demanded by the larger air campaign. Meanwhile, in Japan, the fallout from these drops took on increasingly chaotic forms. Civilians were instructed by police to immediately burn any leaflet they touched. Children who brought them home out of curiosity led to their parents being interrogated. Teachers in rural villages lectured students on the perverse American mind, seeking to corrupt Japanese purity. Newspapers published warnings without quoting the leaflets directly, for fear that even describing them would weaken morale. But curiosity was impossible to suppress. Some citizens secretly hid leaflets in drawers, behind tatami mats, or beneath food stores, reading them in private. Rumors spread that the photos were genuine, that Japanese women abroad had actually taken up with American troops. Others speculated that the panties dropped from the sky were stolen from Japanese households by U.S. soldiers, who then sent them back as trophies. A myth with no basis, yet terrifying to a society trained to see shame as a fate worse than death. On the military side, frontline Japanese units reacted in ways that alarmed even their own officers. At the 129th Infantry Regiment on Luzon, intercepted reports noted that several squads refused to attack positions after receiving leaflet bundles. Officers ordered executions to restore discipline. On Iwo Jima, before the island fell, a small batch of leaflets had drifted ashore after a long-range B-29 mission. Although heavily censored, survivors later recounted the panic it caused among isolated troops, that these images, half erotic, half mocking, could reach one of the most heavily defended islands in the empire, convinced some soldiers that American intelligence could penetrate anywhere. The psychological effect magnified the fear and hopelessness already spreading through Japanese ranks as defeat became inevitable. The OWI analysts reading these intercepts understood they had tapped into a vein of cultural vulnerability far deeper than ordinary propaganda had ever achieved. The leaflets bypassed logic, bypassed politics, and struck at personal identity. The honor of the household, the dignity of the soldier, the purity of the wife, the shame of being absent. It undermined a soldier's conviction that he was dying for something sacred. When the idea of home itself became corrupted by propaganda, the war's meaning eroded. And as the summer dragged on and the firebombing intensified, these psychological wounds widened. Many B-29 missions were now coordinated so that incendiary drops and leaflet drops alternated, creating a devastating psychological rhythm. If the city wasn't burned, its morale was attacked. By mid-July 1945, Tokyo's censorship bureaus were overwhelmed. They demanded reinforcements to collect the leaflets, which now numbered in the tens of millions across the home islands. The Army and Navy bickered over who should handle the crisis. Civilians increasingly ignored the burns or threats from police and began discussing the materials privately. Some mocked them, others feared them, a few believed them entirely. And as the American strategic bombing campaign prepared for what would have been an invasion in late 1945 or early 1946, the psychological warfare planners noted that civilian morale was already brittle, perhaps even collapsing, long before Allied ground forces could ever touch Japanese soil. The war, it seemed, was being fought on multiple fronts, with fire, steel, hunger, and now shame. And each night, the silver wings of the B-29s continued to glide through the dark, dropping quiet storms that wounded pride as deeply as bombs wounded flesh. As the summer of 1945 approached, the psychological warfare missions grew even more aggressive, more experimental, and at times more surreal. By then, the B-29 crews had developed a rhythm that made the leaflet drops feel like a strange hybrid of bombing run and theatrical performance. They were still putting their lives at risk, flying through dangerous weather, anti-aircraft belts, and the unpredictable hazards of long-distance night missions. But instead of checking arming wires and fuse settings, the crews now loaded bundles of delicate silk, glossy photographs, forged handwriting samples, and thousands of stacks of thin white paper. Every crewman involved would later remark that they knew the missions were important. High Command repeatedly emphasized that what they were doing mattered strategically, but it was impossible to ignore how bizarre it felt to be stuffing panties and risque photographs into delivery canisters inside a strategic bomber designed to flatten entire cities. What kept these missions grounded in purpose was the intelligence flowing back from intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations. Japanese troops captured in the Philippines, on Okinawa, and on bypassed island garrisons were increasingly referencing the leaflets. Some called them poison. Others called them shame bombs. A few believed they were messages from the gods meant to test their loyalty. Reports from frontline interrogators showed a pattern. Japanese soldiers, especially those isolated from home for months or years, were uniquely vulnerable to anything suggesting that their sacrifices were meaningless or that their families no longer honored them. The Imperial Japanese Army had built its entire wartime culture around the idea of duty, purity, and spiritual superiority. To crack that facade, the OWI understood it had to strike not at the bodies of Japanese soldiers. Bombers and artillery already did that, but at their souls. Among the most effective pieces of propaganda were the forged personal letters supposedly written by Japanese wives or girlfriends. These were carefully crafted by Japanese-American linguists, many of whom had grown up in Japanese households and understood the subtleties of honor culture. The letters were written in a plain domestic tone, never overly dramatic, because OWI analysts believed soldiers would reject anything that seemed too theatrical. Instead, the letters described quiet resignation. "I waited for you, but you did not return. I was starving, and an American soldier offered us rice. He was kind. I am sorry." Some variants were more graphic, describing intimacy in ways designed to provoke anger and humiliation. But even the understated letters could be devastating to a homesick conscript sitting in a jungle bunker thousands of miles from home. The B-29 crews later recalled how the propaganda officers would handle these forged letters like ammunition. They were packaged carefully, stacked precisely, and paired with matching photographs. The infamous Panties bombs were even more intricately assembled. Boxes arriving from the States contained shipments of silk underwear bought from surplus warehouses or donated by war workers who were told only that their contributions were for a special morale operation. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Each pair was fitted with a sewn-in strip of cloth bearing a message. The messages ranged from crude mockery to chillingly specific intelligence. Some simply said, "A gift from home." Others named the Japanese soldiers' home prefecture or referenced local festivals, customs, or neighborhoods. Information that came from census data and captured documents rather than any fictional espionage. It was designed to make the soldiers think the Americans knew everything, that nothing was safe, that their world was collapsing. By July 1945, the psychological warfare program expanded as B-29s began dropping targeted leaflets over major cities, warning civilians of impending firebomb raids. Although the Panties missions were aimed at soldiers, the broader leaflet campaign was meant to exhaust the Japanese civilian psyche. Millions of Japanese citizens went to sleep each night, knowing a B-29 could appear overhead, carrying nothing more than paper. And that paper might signal where the next inferno would strike. The Japanese Home Ministry collected tens of thousands of the leaflets every day. Street sweepers burned them in barrels. Police were ordered to arrest anyone seen reading or distributing them. But no matter how many were destroyed, more appeared the next night, drifting down from the sky like snow. On the ground, the impact was undeniable. Reports began emerging of entire Japanese units suffering collapses in discipline after seeing the Black Widow leaflets. A few commanders begged their superiors for permission to relocate families to safer areas, not because of American bombs, but because the soldiers could no longer concentrate on fighting. On bypassed islands, where starving Japanese troops huddled in caves, waiting for an attack that would never come, morale crumbled entirely. Marines and Army patrols began finding leaflets tucked into the clothing of dead Japanese soldiers. Sometimes a man who had resisted death for weeks collapsed into suicide immediately after reading one. In other cases, troops marched into American lines, waving the leaflets as proof that the war was hopeless and that returning home would mean humiliation instead of honor. Meanwhile, the B-29 crews continued flying these strange missions into the night sky. Some later confessed they preferred the propaganda runs to conventional bombing. The aircraft were lighter, the missions safer, and the knowledge that they weren't incinerating civilians gave a few men a measure of peace. Others disliked them, feeling they weren't real combat. But every crewman understood one thing. These missions were reaching into the enemy's mind in ways that high explosives could not. When the war finally ended in August 1945, after the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender, many of the soldiers who had received the leaflets stumbled out of the mountains and jungles, carrying the last remnants of their shattered morale. Crumpled photographs, scraps of silk, and folded sheets of psychological warfare material. Interrogators kept them as evidence. Some leaflets survive today in museums and archives. Bizarre relics of a strategy that weaponized shame, sexuality, and fear with clinical precision. The legacy of these operations remains complex. Some historians argue that the psychological leaflets hastened Japan's collapse, saving thousands of American and Japanese lives that would have been lost in prolonged fighting. Others see them as ethically ambiguous, exploiting deep cultural sensitivities in ways that would be controversial today. But all agree on one point. Never before in military history had an Air Force used such intimate, personal weapons. The B-29 was built as a machine of destruction, yet in these missions, it served as a messenger, delivering not fire, but fear, doubt, and a kind of psychological erosion that ultimately proved just as devastating. For the men who flew those missions, the memory persisted for decades. A massive silver bomber roaring through the night sky. Bomb bays open not to unleash explosives, but to scatter silk panties and seductive photographs over an empire already trembling on the edge of defeat. It was one of the strangest chapters of the Pacific War. One that demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb at all, but an idea that lodges in a soldier's mind and refuses to let go.